Think of the Netherlands and you probably picture the same thing everyone else does. Water, canals, windmills, cows on grass that sits below sea level. A horizon so flat you can see weather coming an hour away. Every one of those things is the reason this country was never supposed to build skyscrapers. A quarter of it lies below sea level. Half of it sits less than a meter above. The water is why the ground can't hold a tower. The flatness is reclaimed swamp. And yet Rotterdam has gone from 9 towers over 328 feet in 2000 to more than 24 today. It just approved one at 938 feet, the tallest inhabited building in the entire European Union. Not offices, apartments, in a country that's short more than 400,000 homes. So how do you build that high on a swamp? Why here and almost nowhere else in Europe? And why now? Every one of the 10 tallest buildings in the Netherlands stands in just 2 cities, Rotterdam and The Hague. The Western Netherlands, where all the major cities sit, rests on some of the worst ground you could pick for a skyscraper. The Randstad, Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam, Utrecht, sits on low, wet layers of peat and marine clay. The east and south are a different story entirely, with higher sand near the surface that lets you build straight onto compacted ground. But that barely matters here, because the cities that want to build tall are all in the wet west. To build anything tall, engineers drive piles down through those soft layers until they hit buried sand left behind by the Ice Age. In Amsterdam, the first firm sand sits roughly 45 feet down. Traditional house piles reach about 100 feet. For Rotterdam's Rise Tower, the survey firm Socotec drilled to 360 feet below street level, just to find out what they were dealing with. There's no reachable bedrock anywhere in the country. Amsterdam's canal houses rest on forests of wooden piles, and around 425,000 buildings across the country already face foundation problems, carrying a repair bill estimated between 20 and 30 billion euros by 2050. When your existing low-rises are already losing their battle with the ground underneath them, a 900-foot tower sounds like a genuinely terrible idea. Soft ground was never a wall, though. It was a price tag. A nation that reclaimed entire provinces from the sea was never truly stopped by wet soil. Friction piles have worked for decades. Even the Burj Khalifa floats on 192 of them. The real gate was always cost, regulation, and political will. Because Europe has other instincts. In many European cities, an old church is still the tallest thing on the skyline. In Utrecht, a long-standing rule holds that buildings stay below the Dom Tower, a Gothic structure finished in 1382, standing at 368 feet. 7 centuries later, the tallest modern building in the city still stops short of it. And in Amsterdam, Schiphol's flight paths and more than 9,000 listed monuments push anything tall out to the edges of the city. Geology, regulation, culture, everything lines up against building high in the Netherlands. And yet 3 Dutch cities are about to go higher than they ever have. The explanation starts on a single afternoon in 1940. On May 14, 1940, the Luftwaffe dropped roughly 97 tons of bombs on the center of Rotterdam. The attack lasted about 15 minutes. Thousands of buildings were destroyed, around 900 people were killed, tens of thousands lost their homes. And it happened while Dutch commanders were still negotiating surrender. A recall order was issued during those talks. It never reached the planes. The bombers had already retracted their radios for the run. The only signal left was flares, fired up from the ground. One formation saw them and turned back. The other didn't. Germany then threatened to level Utrecht next. The Netherlands capitulated the following morning. The same kind of medieval churches and brick townhouses that tourists admire in Amsterdam today were reduced to rubble in a quarter of an hour. After the war, the city made a choice that would define it for the next century. Instead of restoring what it had lost, Rotterdam went modern. Wider streets, open squares, a fundamentally different kind of city. While the rest of the Netherlands preserved its low-rise character, Rotterdam kept reaching upward. In 1991, the Delft Support Office complex hit 496 feet and ended the debate over whether the country had any real skyscrapers at all. It was an insurance headquarters, and it held the national record for nearly 2 decades. Rotterdam earned the nickname Manhattan on the Maas. The cities that kept their medieval centres never got this permission. Rotterdam's blank canvas came from what it lost, not what it planned. But even for Rotterdam, what's coming next is a different animal. In 2021, the Zalmhaven Tower topped out at 705 feet, the tallest building in the Netherlands. That record is about to be broken by a wide margin. Rise, the tower from the start of this video, has an adopted zoning plan at Hofplan Square that would clear the next tallest Dutch building by 233 feet. Which brings us back to the problem nobody has solved yet. You still have to stand it up on ground that eats buildings. Rotterdam knows how to build tall. It does not know how to build this tall. The engineers at Bureau Happold, brought in to work out the structure, put it plainly. The Netherlands has no real history of building towers at this height. There's no local playbook, no precedent to copy. So the work starts underground with the question, what is actually down there? That's why Soccertech drilled to 360 feet, not to build anything, just to find out what the tower would be standing on. What they were looking for is that buried Ice Age sand. In the Western Netherlands, it's the only thing solid enough to carry a building this heavy. And the answer sets the entire design. To hold the tower up, Bureau Happold calculated it would take around 300 piles, driven to roughly 213 feet below sea level, more than double the depth of a normal Dutch house foundation, 300 times over, packed into a single city centre plot. And the plot is the second problem. Hofplan is one of the busiest squares in Rotterdam. There's no room to spread out, no margin, which creates a brutal dependency. If the ground throws up a surprise during piling, if a single pile has to be shifted or gets missed, that isn't a groundworks problem. It's a structural problem. The building above has to be redesigned around it. The tower itself is reinforced concrete built around a central core with structural walls extended out toward the facades, stiffening it against the wind while still letting daylight into the apartments. And it isn't one tower. Rise is 3. The Hofplan Tower, plus 2 more at roughly 525 and 490 feet. For parts of that ensemble, Powerhouse Company went somewhere almost nobody associates with skyscrapers. Hybrid timber in place of pre-tensioned concrete. Wood, on ground this soft. Which raises the obvious question. If 425,000 Dutch buildings are already sinking, why won't these? Because they're not standing on the same thing. The buildings in trouble are old, resting on wooden piles in ground where the water table has dropped, exposed the wood to air, and it rots. The towers are concrete, driven far deeper into sand that's been sitting there since the last ice age. The problem was never the weight, it was what you were resting it on. So that's the answer to the question we opened with. You don't beat the swamp. You go underneath it, 213 feet down, and you find the Ice Age. That housing number is the whole story. 410,000 homes short. The national target calls for 900,000 new homes by 2030, but only about 69,000 were completed in 2025, far below the government's annual goal of 100,000. Land in the Randstad is running out. Density around transit is the clearest path left. And the towers going up reveal a shift in what Dutch high-rises are actually for. The old record holders were corporate addresses. Maastoren topped out in 2009 and became Deloitte's home base. When NVRDV described Rotterdam's central district, they called it dominated by office buildings and said they were adding residents to make it more mixed. The new wave is almost entirely about putting people in apartments. That flip is what makes this pipeline different from anything before it. De Sax, Baan Tower, Post Rotterdam. 3 towers, cranes up, physically in the air right now. The approved pipeline reaches much further. Rise would hold roughly 1,500 homes, about half of them affordable. There's a hotel and some office space in the mix, but the tower is built around the apartments, not the other way around. That's the inversion. It would also replace the 226 social housing units currently on the site and add hundreds more. Quadrico, a 722-foot tower by New York's Shop Architects, would anchor a new neighborhood at the Rheinhaven harbor, same 50% affordability mandate. But if you want to see how hard this actually is, look at The Hague. Two proposed towers there, called Bellevue, would stand 754 feet beside the central station. Getting to that number has been a fight. They started at 590 feet. The council cut them to 525, calling them too tall. The developers said that made the project financially unworkable, and they went back up to 590. Now they're proposed at 754. Nothing about this pipeline is guaranteed, and one developer-architect pair sits behind almost all of it. Red Company and Powerhouse Company, both founded by the same man, Nan de Roo. Then there's Eindhoven, where a completely different engine is driving the same outcome. In March 2026, the City Council gave chipmaker ASML final approval for a second campus, one that will eventually bring 20,000 jobs to the region. Some councillors voted against it for exactly one reason. They were afraid the city couldn't house the people. Eindhoven sits on higher, sandier ground. No swamp engineering. Its problem is pure demand. The Dutch aren't alone in this. Europe is one of its most active periods of high-rise construction in decades, and the towers going up are increasingly homes, not offices. But the Dutch jump is happening faster than most. 30 years ago, the country had exactly one building anywhere near 500 feet. Within a decade, it could have the tallest inhabited structure in the European Union. The skepticism is loud, and it isn't hard to find. Across Dutch forums, the same line runs over and over. These apartments will be too expensive. Investors will buy them up. Ordinary people will never set foot inside. And the evidence is already standing on the skyline. When Zalmhaven opened, rent started around €1,700 a month. The penthouses sold for up to $5 million. When it topped out as the tallest building in the country, Dutch public broadcaster NOS ran the verdict in its headline: "Too tall to solve the housing shortage." That's the last tower they finished. It became a luxury address. So the new ones come with promises attached. At Quadrico, half the homes are capped, €310,000 to buy or $1,000 a month to rent. But to make those numbers work, the project needed €11 million of government subsidy. The affordable half doesn't pay for itself. Somebody has to. And nobody will say what these towers cost to build. The developers don't publish it. What we do know is that Rise had to be delivered on what its own engineers called a tight construction budget. Tight enough that they ran simulations to shave 20% off the cost of the stability system alone. A mandate is a promise on paper. It survives contact with the construction budget, or it doesn't. Meanwhile, construction costs keep climbing. Building permits dropped again in 2025, and every one of those 300 piles costs money. There's a sharper objection underneath all of it too, one the Dutch keep making themselves. Towers aren't the densest way to house people. Paris and Barcelona fit more residents per square mile into 6-story blocks without the elevators, the wind engineering, or the piles. If the goal is homes, why is the answer the most expensive possible shape for a building? The counter is that Rotterdam has already used the easy land. Boxed in by a river and a port, up is what's left. And then there's the question of whether Europeans even want to live this way. When BIM covered European skyscrapers, one of the most liked comments on the whole video pushed back on the premise itself, that Europeans want tall towers reshaping their historic cities at all. Many Dutch residents still prefer their 1930s row houses to a 40th floor apartment. Across most of Europe, history keeps the skyline low. In Rotterdam, history was erased in 15 minutes, and that erasure is what let everything now rise. The postcard was always the problem. Rotterdam is the one city that lost its postcard. Whether the rest of the country follows, and whether those towers end up housing the people who actually need homes, will decide if this boom is remembered as a turning point or just another skyline built for people who can't afford to live in it. So, should the rest of Europe follow Rotterdam up into the sky? Or is a low skyline worth protecting, even in a housing crisis? Tell us where you land in the comments, and subscribe for more MegaBuilds stories. See you in the next one.